Over the past few decades, major institutions around the world have documented what we have known all along. The human body is a conductor of energy and has a detectable energy field. In a state of disease, the energy flows differently than in a state of health. At the cellular level, a change in energy flow is the first detectable sign of a disease. Correcting any disturbances in the energy flow plays a key role in achieving a rapid and sustainable return to health. In this seminar, learn how the bioenergetic field relates to disease conditions, diagnosis, and treatment, and steps you can take now to correct your energy field. I would like to introduce our speaker this evening. Dr. Sangeeta Paddy practiced obstetrics and gynecology in the Washington, D.C. and New York area before opening an integrative medical center in Orlando, Florida. She graduated from the University of Maryland School of Medicine and completed her residency at Georgetown University School of Medicine, Washington, D.C. Dr. Paddy's special interest and strength has been in helping healthcare providers learn how to put together and integrate into real practice the vast amount of information in the restorative medicine field. She is the director of the Clinical Preceptor Program, which trains doctors and health practitioners in restoring optimal body function through protocols for hormone balance, nutrition, and detoxification. She also runs an online platform for integrative health practitioners to communicate problem cases. Dr. Paddy is president of Sajun Institute for Restorative and Regenerative Medicine, which offers integrated evidence-based medical therapies combining conventional, natural, and complementary. Dr. Paddy, I'm so excited. I will turn the webinar over to you. If you do have questions this evening, please submit them using your chat option. Thank you, Dr. Paddy.
Thank you. Well, welcome everybody, and we are obviously connecting today over a bioenergetic or an energetic mechanism, so thank you for that, and thank you for joining me. Thank you, Lindsay, for that wonderful introduction. I'm going to get started of the human energy field, how we measure it, and how we can correct the energy field, and also a few steps that you can take today. I'm really excited about this topic, and I'm going to give you a few cases at the very end. So I'd like to give you a little bit of an introduction to how I got interested in the topic, and it began really as a child. My father, who is an elementary particle physicist, who always thought that I was going to be a physicist, actually started teaching me about protons and electrons and atoms and stars and cosmos when I was very young. And he's very well versed in the grand unification theories and so on. So I really got a pretty advanced understanding of it, and never really realized as I transitioned from a computer science major to an electrical engineer major to a zoology major and then on to medicine, that indeed this particular field will come back to be the one step that I would say is one of the biggest steps that I have seen in my practice in terms of getting people well. Most of us were introduced to this concept many years ago, and I jokingly referred to the possibility that within the next 10 to 20 years we wouldn't be using knives in pharmaceuticals because we would be utilizing energy devices and the energy field of the human body to correct and sustain great health. What happened as I went through medicine is that I ended up in a situation where necessity became the mother of invention. And what I mean by that is that I started off in a traditional OBGYN practice and then ended up working abroad in many countries under Bill Gates funding, and realized that there are many things and many tools that I didn't know about that could correct the human body. And that was the beginning of my journey into developing a model to restore the body. And obviously, I started with hormones as an OBGYN, quickly realized that the nutrients activated the hormones, and this was the fuel tank. I was very happy because I thought, well, I got it. Get the hormones at 75th percentile, get the nutrition at the 75th percentile, things will be great. Very soon after that, realized that we had to detoxify the body. Very soon after that, realized that if we do not balance the mind and the body, and especially the subconscious, because 90% of our thought processes are subconscious, and that ends up changing the entire equation of how this stuff works. So many of us who've been in this field of integrative medicine have learned our hormones and have learned the nutrients and have learned how to detox the body, and even how to help the patient believe that they could get well, because we, of course, now know that the thought process that you have your best life in front of you and that you can be disease-free creates a whole different set of neurotransmitters, creates a whole different set of chemicals, creates a whole different energy field than the other thought process. And some of that is conscious, some of that is subconscious, and it turns out that there are mechanisms by which we can reprogram that subconscious tune. And I realized as I started to introduce some of these mechanisms into the practice that they were not just add-ons, they were literally the key, because I could fill the fuel tank with hormones and nutrition all day long, and if I had a hole at the bottom of the bucket, that in terms of how the subconscious or the conscious mind was overactive, or the physical body being in pain or too much activity, I would just be chasing the tail. So it turned out that this ended up being the most important intervention in everything we did. These are some of the tools that I've been using for about 12 years or more. And what ended up happening in this journey is that the energy field effect kept presenting itself. It started with, of course, some of the traditional things we know about: EKG, EEG, magnetic resonance imaging, laser. Then acupuncture, which I saw in my conventional practice being used to turn breech babies. I started to notice that my laboring patients who believed that they could do it without an epidural or without pain medication were able to achieve that, and those who did not were not. I started to read a book called Love, Medicine, and Miracles, where Bernie Siegel, a general surgeon, explained his journey through being diagnosed with tuberculosis and being placed in a sanatorium at age 9 to succumb to the disease and die because there was no treatment. And he went in and noticed that there were two groups of people. One group of people, which is most of them, who were getting ready to exit their body, and another group of people who refused to accept their diagnosis, and he decided to join that group. It was a small group, but 100% of them escaped healthy, and it was the beginning of the understanding of the power of placebo. We now know that placebo is not some minor thing. The heads of some large pharmaceutical companies are actually saying that if they could bottle placebo, they'd be rich, because it turns out that it changes the energy field. It changes the entire neurotransmitter pathways, just the power of what we think. The next thing I got introduced to was homeopathy in my practice, and then muscle testing, regional hyperthermia, which is a form of heat therapy, which in our practice has literally turned around the treatment of masses. Sound therapy that I got exposed to in many different centers, and then finally brought into my own centers. Patients who would come through the door showing me their results with gems and crystals, understanding and seeing the power of prayer, and of course all the questions around the electromagnetic field. And in 2016, the new warning from the American Pediatric Association regarding reduction of cell phone exposure in children. And I'm sure that many of you who are listening to this would be able to put a similar list together, because I am sure that you have had the patients come through the door say they've used this, they've used that, they've used the other, and sometimes we don't know what to make of it, especially when they say it works and we don't know anything about it. But it just turns out that I have linked all these things back to the energy field and correcting the energy field, and also believing in that correction. And I think this is, of course, a business principle, which is whether you think you can or whether you think you can't, you're right. It turns out that it's also a very powerful biological principle that's written about in great detail by Bruce Lipton, who's a cell biologist who documented his findings in a book called The Biology of Belief, which is an incredible book about this thing. The history of energy medicine, it turns out, is very ancient. In fact, in every culture and in every medical tradition before ours, healing was accomplished by moving energy. Magnetite was used by ancient Chinese, Egyptians, and Greeks. And the way it worked is by increasing blood flow. But of course, anytime we come up with a why, we're very limited. We always want to know why. And in medicine, we have many opportunities to study mechanisms, and realizing that any mechanism we come up with is probably accompanied by another 100 mechanisms that we don't know about, and they slowly reveal themselves. The laying of hands, which was described in many texts and many Bibles, and modern versions of that, which included Reiki and healing touch, which were used in hospitals and nursing schools. In 1773, Dr. Mesmer used magnets and hands, and he eventually was investigated by 3 commissions and found that all the results were a result of the suggestion to the patient, and really didn't have anything to do with what he was doing. And it turned out that it would be difficult in any circumstance to understand whether or not what we do on the energy field actually does work on its own, because generally, as you know, we're doing so many other things. And I would put to you to think about the fact that all the other things, every single thing we do on that 5-point model, whether we provide a hormone, or we provide a magnesium or B12, or we correct the pH, or we correct the mind, the subconscious, or the body, and the oxygenation. No matter where we go with that, the fact of the matter is, somewhere in there, each one of those things is affecting the energy field as it flows through the body. Electrotherapy devices thrived in the 1800s. Thousands of doctors all over the world used devices like this. And in fact, if you look at the Sears and Roebuck catalog in 1902, these were some of the electrical devices that actually were used many years ago. They were they were used for various different things: rheumatism, pain, muscle strength. They're really rather funny. But there was a report that came out in 1910, and at that point, all the electrotherapy devices were legally excluded. So everybody ended up having to give up their devices into what they called the Museum of Quackery. And all those devices were there. This brings us to the 20th century, where Dr. Harold Burr from Yale, who was a full professor at Yale, started to document the energy effects in a book called The Fields of Life. He was way ahead of his time because he really was studying the nervous system and published dozens of studies on the nervous system, and started to document the energy field of the body and how it interacted with trees and how that interacted with animals and how the energy fields actually changed in advance of physical and clinical findings. And again, at that point, he was ahead of his time, but at this moment, these are still in the Yale Journal of Biology and Medicine in the School of Medicine at Yale, which is considered part of their very important collections. As time went on, we found that modern medicine actually confirmed that every event in the body whether it is normal or it is pathophysiologic, produces changes in the electrical and magnetic fields, which are detectable. And that is what we're going to see. A few examples of this. In 1939, Burr started to document that you could measure ovulation and detect it by daily measurements of the electrical field between the fingers. And in 1975, Friedenberg actually patented the device that was able to document that ovulation, and they actually were able to document it 4 to 5 days before, because it was a normal event and it changes the electrical magnetic field. There are many examples of this. Some of the examples come from studying conductance at acupuncture points, where liver disease is reflected by an 18-fold increase in conduction at the knee. At that point, when this was documented, people still believed that liver disease should be detected in the liver and lung disease should be detected in the lung. And the concept that there are many energetic pathways that are affecting and controlling the liver was not accepted. However, these were documented. They were able to document a 6 to 7-fold higher conductance in cancers than in regular tissue. And at this point, bioenergy fields, which were basically deemed to be nonsense and quackery, started to become an important field in biomedical research, leading all the way to, what was announced by CNN just a few days ago, which is a laser cap, which allows paralyzed patients to communicate using just the energy field. And Dr. James Oshman is one of the people who has documented this history very well, and I will be going through it in a lot of detail during the workshop. So how does the energy field of the body work? What do we know about this, and how much do we know about this? If we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. And this has been a key principle that has turned up over and over and over as I discovered that from the hormones I needed the nutrients, and from the nutrients I needed to correct the bowel and the gallbladder and the toxins, and from the toxins I had to deal with the conscious and subconscious mind, and then I had to deal with the body, and then all of a sudden I realized that you have this whole energetic field which runs through the body, and it actually is only in its best state if it's connected to the natural magnetic field of the earth. The seat of our electromagnetic field lies in the heart. And when magnetometers have been used to document this, because these are low-level signals, it turns out that the heart is 100,000 times stronger electrically and 5,000 times stronger magnetically than the brain. Stronger in this sense means is giving a stronger signal. So the heart is actually a much more powerful electromagnetic center, and it is now believed that it is actually originating the entire signal transmission to the brain. This is diagram that shows the connection and the synchronicity between a mother and baby in terms of the heart monitor and the EEG of the baby. This is after birth, so it's not physical contact. It basically is just the mother thinking about the baby. The way that we ended up being able to detect these low-level magnetic fields was actually a process of almost 50 to 100 years of going from detecting large signals to finally being able to detect small signals by shielding off the body in a squid magnetometer and being able to measure minor variations. And this is the kind of device that allowed us to document the energy field from the heart. And what we found is that the human heart emits an energy field that extends 12 to 15 feet from the body in every direction, which means if I am standing next to anybody, my heart rate variability, which is controlled by my emotions, will be projecting and affecting the heart rate variability of the person next to me. It's actually this principle that has propelled the Fortune 500 companies to learn how to help people to get into coherent heart rate states, because everybody's heart rate variability affects everybody else's. This field sends signals to every cell of the body, affecting physical, mental, and emotional well-being. So our entire emotions and the way that our heart rate variability is transmitting through the body. How does it transmit? There's only one system that touches all the other systems, and it's the largest system. It's the intracellular matrix. It's the ground tissue, and it's a continuous fibrous network that extends to every part of the body. So when the heart beats and sends the electromagnetic field out, it is being carried and transmitted through the intracellular matrix to every other part of the body. What is this matrix composed of? Yes, there's collagen. Yes, that is the basic protein that lies there, and it carries electrons and protons. But if you look at the B picture on the right, there's actually a whole section where electrons and water make up the majority of this. And we know that water is 80% of the body, so of course it is no surprise that water would be a major method of conduction, and in fact, a method of communication in the body which transmits signals faster than the nervous system or the blood vessels ever could possibly do. The immune system is regulated by whether or not we're grounded or not, and I am going to be talking about grounding in a little bit. The thing to note in this slide is that when we are wearing shoes and we have an injury, that inflammatory response is barricaded, and it's not possible for the excess charges to be neutralized. The electrons from the ground are conducted when we are barefoot. So if we have an injury, and I'll show you some examples of this later, we can accelerate the healing greatly by having access to the electrons, free electrons from the ground. So what is it about water that makes it so important? Of course we know that water is the majority of this planet, and we know that water is the majority of this human body and every other living thing we know. And we learned of water as H2O. But of course, over the last decades, people and scientists all over the world have started to understand that water structure varies based upon the frequencies and the vibrations that the water is exposed to, which means the angles between the molecules is different. And that water structure is believed to affect the intercellular communication. Some of you may have seen this. These are a researcher, Masaru Emoto's photographs that were done under electron microscopy, showing some of the differences between the crystals in the water and the structure that it maintains with various different exposures. So the recap of how this energy field is carried is that the heart generates a major energy impulse. The transition of this impulse is carried through the nerves, the blood vessels, and most importantly, the tissue matrix. And I'm suggesting that the water is the major piece of that. And therefore, anything that affects the heart field will affect health because it's affecting the energy field. So what affects the heart field? The heart field interacts with and is affected by the electromagnetic field of the Earth and anything with electromagnetic qualities. So whether it's the people that were around, or the animals that were around, or the plants and the trees, or even the magnetic field of the Earth, which produces a low-level Schumann wave, which turns out to be almost matched identically to the frequency of the heartbeat. This is another depiction of the same, and basically these are magnetic lines created by solar winds. But we have to realize that we're living on a planet and we are in a solar system, and the energy systems of all of it interacts with our energy field. In fact, Einstein was quoted with saying, "The field that connects everything together is the sole governing agency of the particle." So, the field determines how the atom behaves. What am I talking about here? We used to believe that the atoms were made of things in the center and things that circle the nucleus. We now know that the atom is a quantum atom, which is consisting of waves of energy, not particles of things. That would be the picture on the right. So to change the atom, we need to change the energy the atom lives in. This is very important. To change the physical world or the stuff, you have to change the energy that the stuff is in. This is getting very interesting. What is that energy made of? The field is made of electrical energy and magnetic energy. The physics text says if you change the electrical field, you change the atom, because you change the energy levels, and that's the Stark effect. It's called the Stark effect. If you change the magnetic field, you change the atom and the energy levels. That's the Zeeman effect. This is in the physics text. So what does that mean? What organ in your body produces the strongest electrical field, and which organ produces the strongest magnetic field? It's the electromagnetic field of the heart, which means our best methodology of correcting the electrical system within us that's in our control is to alter the electromagnetic field of the heart through the emotions and the heart rate variability, which I will be showing you in a little bit later on in this presentation. This is a very important piece of this, because this is one of the things that we try to teach all of our patients. So how do we measure and detect these fields? And you can see lots of things listed here. I'm going to talk about a few of them. So the very first one is the heart rate variability. And of course, we know that it turns out that heart rate variability is based on emotions. The top graph is what we call an incoherent heart rate variability, where we have emotions of frustration and anxiety and worry and irritation. And interestingly, that heart rate variability is going to use the most hormone and nutrients. So if you want to preserve the reserve, you don't want this heart rate variability. This is the rumble where somebody walks in the room in this state and it transmits to everybody else. All of us have experienced this, as opposed to what we call a coherent sine wave, which is appreciation, love, and care. So the heart rate variability can be in a coherent state, and we know that if we do meditation for 30 to 60 minutes, we can put ourselves there. But with research that has been done by the Heart Math Institute in Boulder Creek, California, we know that actually this particular pattern can be achieved in as little as 30 seconds. Usually we say 3 to 5 minutes. And it consists of a mechanism where we teach people to bring their heart rate variability to a sine wave by recreating a virtual reality of a moment in time that's greatly joyful, that's greatly happy, that's greatly loving. And imagine what it looks like, what it sounds like, what it feels like, literally a virtual reality. It puts people in the coherent state in about 30 seconds. And there's hundreds of studies at this point that are done by this institute. This is one of the mechanisms I was saying is used by the Fortune 500 companies, just showing the difference in the brain blood flow between anger and appreciation and the heart rate variability. So we know that this is altering the entire body. And we know that coherent heart rate variability is associated with lowering all disease and improves a lot of these things. And in fact, many colleges in the United States are putting this into the standard 101 requirements as a class. So that's one detection method. What about muscle testing? Everyone in this field probably has heard about a patient that's come in and said, oh, I got muscle testing. And why is it that I wrote here muscle testing can be reliable? If you look at the studies on muscle testing and you look at NIH's CAM Institute's full review on it, you will find that there's inadequate randomized controlled trials, and the things that have been studied, including the one that I quote here, are basically do not support that muscle testing has any real reliable result in terms of diagnosing or testing. The reason why I write it can be reliable is because after a decade, basically, of utilizing this in my office through some of the practitioners that are there and seeing it applied, we have been able to really benefit from this in extremely sick patients. And I will show you how, I actually have a case that I'll show you that mostly our gastric cases really get turned around by this muscle testing, and I'll tell you why once we get there. What about detecting light coming out of the body? So we talked about heart rate variability, we talked about muscle testing. This is all about how we detect the field. It turns out that the human body emits low-intensity light in the visible range. That means between infrared and UV in the visible range, but it's low intensity. And because it's low intensity, it's difficult to detect, and there have been different methods, including what we call Kirlian imagery. That's actually a picture of a finger giving off that light. But this is not something that we standardly use. It's just very important to know that low intensity light in the visible range is given off by the body. And high intensity light in the far infrared range is also given off. And this we have utilized, in fact, this we utilize in our office because this is a strong infrared radiation, which you're able to use to detect heat, another form of energy, which is given off by the body. If you look at these images, the top images are, the more red there is, the more inflammation there is. And you will notice that between the top images and the bottom images, there's less inflammation. The more blue and red it is, the cooler it is. I would put to you that this is one of the earliest methods of detecting that something is off, because it's the electrical field between two cells that's off, and it starts to create some infrared emission that we can detect. And in this case, it was actually grounding that created this difference, and I'll show you that. So there's many factors that affect the field. And for right now, that's all I'm going to say about detection methods. We'll be talking about many more when we get into our conference in March. What about the factors? So I know that the 5 factors in the 5-point model affect the field. We know now that emotions affect the heart field, the structure of water. We know that other people, plants, and animals, and the earth fields. And what about electromagnetic radiation? So whether we do correct the emotions and thoughts, or we correct the hormones, or we correct the nutrition, and notice I said sourcing, because does it matter where the nutrition comes from? Does it matter what intention and ethics was behind that nutrition? Does it matter what journey that nutrient has taken and what it's been exposed to? Yes, it does, because the entire structure of it changes, because the structure of the water, which is 80% of it, changes. And then, of course, taking care of toxins. So anytime we do anything on this, we're affecting the energy field, especially the water, because the water from one source has a unique signature frequency different from another source. And this is exactly what I think is one of the factors that is thought to influence the energy field in the blue zones. Many of you have heard of the blue zones. There's a book called The Blue Zones, and we have an expert in the workshop, Dr. John Apsley, who will be speaking about possible factors that could influence the energy field in the blue zones. But obviously, something else is going on in the blue zones, because people look at diet, they look at the way they live in those areas, and it turns out that the field in which they're living has some similarities, especially in terms of the water, in terms of the soil, in terms of the intimacy and love between people, connection. Human connectivity has been shown to be one of the most powerful things that affects the energy field of the human body. And it turns out that this was actually also documented by Dean Ornish, who managed to prove reversal of cardiac disease by using a model that basically had stress management, meditation, some dietary changes, moderate exercise, and most importantly, intimacy and love. So let's talk about electromagnetic radiation, because this is something you hear every day. We're swimming in a sea of electromagnetic radiation produced by many appliances. And of course, you have your patients coming in and asking, what is the effect of these things? And it's difficult to separate them out. And we're always stuck in a position of just using some common sense, which common sense would tell us that if we are an electrical body, and if the Earth is an electromagnetic body, then anything that affects the electromagnetic field is going to affect everything, whether we can prove it or not. And that would be my common sense. And that's pretty much what I share with the patient. But you'll note that there is a growing news reports about things. And if you look at, some of the things that people have been documenting with smart meters, and this is dark field microscopy. These red blood cells are supposed to be nice and round. And I was actually quite surprised to find out that all of our neighborhood meters have been changed to smart meters. There's some places around the world where people are complaining about them because people who are sensitive to this kind of electrical field are able to feel it. So we can't really, and of course this 2016 report from the American Academy of Pediatrics, and they finally took a position and basically said that we should be reducing our exposure to wireless radiation and cell phones, especially children. Now, what does this do? Does this create a fear? Because obviously we could say, well, don't do this, don't do that, don't eat that, don't eat GMO. I think what happens is it creates awareness. And what awareness does is it helps us drive public policy. It helps us make smarter decisions. Maybe don't keep the phone right next to us. And actually, if you go to this report, you'll see the 10 recommendations they made. And it's things like reducing time, texting, don't hold it to your head, simple things. So I think that just some common sense is where you go with these kind of things. So that brings me to the next part, which is very exciting, which is what's out there for the correction of the energy field. And obviously we discussed a little bit about possible factors that are common to the blue zones. But we know that I could make a list here that has over 100 interventions in it. Body interventions, mind interventions, changing the water, changing the temperature, magnets. We saw from that Zeeman effect, right? If we move a magnet, we change the energy field, We change the stuff, which is we change the atom. Sound therapy, all matter is formed by vibration, correcting the space around us in terms of how does the energy flow around the house. If you look at ancient texts that are in India, they actually talk about which direction the houses face in. It's extremely important because it's important to align with the geodynamic or the solar lines in order to have good health. We know that every cell in the body actually has some kind of magnetic orientation. And interestingly, all the bugs in our body also have a magnetic orientation. So it becomes quite relevant to know what to do with that. Reiki or hands-on healing, which we actually have in our office now, cell phone protection devices, and bioresonance devices. And these are some of the things that we're going to be covering in much more detail when we do our workshop. But I'm going to go through a couple of them right now. So I already mentioned that factors that may affect the energy field in blue zones include the heart connections, the water, the soil, and I would say these are probably three of the most important ones. What about something that many of you might have heard about, which is grounding? When you walk with naked feet, how can you forget the earth? Because we were born with an electromagnetic field going through our body that is also going through the earth. And in order to benefit from that, we have to be connected to the earth and the plants and the sun. One of the most important recommendations that we make to every single patient is that in the morning hours, and this is also documented in Eastern medicine quite well, you want to get yourself in nature between sunrise and 10 to 11 in the morning. This terminology, earthing / grounding, a lot of documentation by Dr. Sinatra and Dr. Oshman, who are pioneers in this field. They published dozens of studies on this field, including this study, which is the health implications of reconnecting the human body to the Earth's surface electrons. And there are studies just showing that grounding synchronizes the cortisol, improves sleep, pain, and stress. There were significant changes in this. This one's really important. The earthing reduces blood viscosity in 2 hours, and I wanted to go through a little bit of that. There's two features and two factors that you can study to tell you what blood viscosity is doing. And we know that blood viscosity is one of the major contributing factors to cardiovascular events. And one of them is the zeta potential, which when they measured it in the RBCs increased 2.7-fold in 2 hours. They also studied clumping of cells, and what they were able to find is that besides the zeta potential change, the number of clumps of 4, 3, and 2 clumps completely decreased, and the number of single cells increased. So the picture on the right is kind of where you want to be, because that's where you're oxygenating, that's where you're not having clumping and clotting, and they measured it by millivolts, and that's what the zeta potential reflects. We know that the autonomic nervous system and skin conductance is altered within 2 hours, within 2 seconds of grounding. So although those studies were done with 2 hours, even in 2 seconds, the conductance of the skin is completely different. Imagine how powerful that is. We are literally a conductor walking around collecting an electrical charge from everything around us, whether it's a car or it's a building or it's a floor or it's whatever, or people. So bringing ourselves back into that earth and letting that ground itself and get neutralized is and was a very important part of ancient times when we actually walked around naked, possibly, and with no shoes on. So this was a study where there's some pretty interesting findings showing the grounding reducing inflammation. And I'm cutting to the chase with a couple of pictures here, which this is basically an 84-year-old diabetic woman who had an 8-month-old non-healing open wound ulcer. And she had a 30-minute daily grounding session with her feet in the soil. And after 2 weeks, actually after 1 week, she had already healed to the second picture, and after 2 weeks to the third picture. And you can imagine that's after 8 months of sitting at that level. And the vascular imaging showed that the circulation basically improved. And this is really a remarkable thing. There is a doctor, Jeff Spencer, who traveled with the Tour de France, and one of the major mechanisms that he used to help people heal was grounding patches. And so this is 2 days after a pretty major injury, and these are just the pictures. You know, the third picture, the first picture is day 1, day 0, day 1, day 2. And we can see that it can have a pretty profound effect. I showed you this picture before, and this is, again, before and afters of just placing the feet in the soil. In this study, they also did studies of white blood cells and neutrophils, and there were significant differences in inflammatory cells. And the thought process here is that we know that reactive oxygen is part of inflammation and are actually beneficial. But when they are in excess, they cause damage. And that's due to an unpaired electron, which is in a high energy state. If you happen to have an antioxidant around that can donate an electron, you can bring that free radical to a stable state. The theory is that because the Earth continuously receives electrons from thousands of lightning strikes that occur every day on this planet, it becomes a source of free electrons. And using a voltmeter, you can actually see which way the electrons go. So this becomes one of the ways in which this mechanism reduces inflammation. So I think I have a few minutes. I want to show you 2 simple cases. You know, anytime you're using any new methods and you're using a lot of different things, it does become difficult for you to know what's doing what. But I can tell you that ever since I've started to use any of these energetic mechanisms, including the power of the belief system and the power of controlling the heart rate variability and what message the heart is putting out, we have seen a huge jump in the results of our patients, much beyond anything that I'd seen before. And we started introducing these kind of things actively over the last 2 years. And over this year, we're actually going to be dedicating an entire section of our office to some major bioenergetic therapeutics. So this is an example, a 45-year-old who comes in complaining of a 40-pound weight gain over a period of few years. And as you know, weight gain is always a manifestation of underlying imbalances, and you're bound to find out that the patient has low energy, is not sleeping, has a low sex drive, has a high stress level, is unhappy, and especially about self-image, which is understandable. But what happens when we are in this state of stress is that the heart rate variability is not going to be in a coherent state. It's going to be in an incoherent state, which means that we're going to be burning down the reserve, burning down the nutrients, burning down the hormones. What does that create? That creates a state of depletion. And in a state of depletion, the body believes that it's depleted. It believes that it's in a state of an emergency. So what does it do? It starts to store everything we eat. You eat a celery stick, it's going to the middle. You can exercise till you're blue in the face, you can eat nothing. The body's in a complete storage mechanism. So filling the tank with the hormones and nutrients is only part of the picture. The other part of the picture has to be to figure out how to get this person into a place of internal happiness and internal contentness with themselves. And this is where we use some of the subconscious techniques, including the heart math that I talked about. And interestingly, so this slide here is important because it talks about the preservation of the reserve. You'll see patients come in and say, oh, I'm going to jump on an exercise program, and I'm really going to do that. And I'm having lots of pain, but I'm going to jump on an exercise program. I have a lot of stress. And the fact of the matter is that with an aggressive program, they can lose weight, especially if you've corrected some hormones and nutrients. But at the end of the day, it turns out that if they keep firing their nervous system from pain or activity or subconscious thoughts, they will continue to drain and deplete that fuel tank. So there's nothing sustainable about it. And what we learned was that in these patients, you have to deal with that subconscious first. You have to bring that heart rate variability from a hyperactive state to a coherent state. You have to create some sense of peace and joy and ask people to fill their cup with joy, because usually the depletion is not only hormones and nutrients. It's not just physiological. It's also the cup of joy. Where's the cup of joy? Has life turned into a checklist of things to do? And if that's what's happened, we ask people to step back and start to put things into their life that give them joy. Put themselves into a virtual reality state where they're able to get into a coherent pattern and relive what the whole body experiences when you go into sine wave, and what everybody around you experiences when you are in a sine wave, which is, this is my image of where I am. I've tried that. I can't do it, but this is the moment. So you're trying to replace yourself into a spot where you can see that moment, feel it, taste it, hear it, all of it. So, and smell it. So all the senses go to that, and it's a form of meditation. It's a form of heart-focused meditation, and that's the heart math, which I was telling you we'd be teaching. This lady did lose the weight, but you can guess that what we did is we did the hormones and nutrients. We waited until her energy was good and until she had a stress mechanism that was good, and then we put her through the program. And it is sustainable when one does that. So I promised to share with you where I have used muscle testing. And I never was really familiar with muscle testing when I first, I started hearing patients coming and talking about muscle testing, and then I had the great joy of adding a practitioner to my office, Dr. Gregerson, who used muscle testing along with Oriental medicine and acupuncture. And over a period of 5 to 6 years, I started to realize that there were cases that I needed that help on, and the ones where I found it to be most useful and consistently reliable was in gastric cases. So examples would be my 42-year-old male with severe IBS for 10 years. And we have a certain set of things we do when we have a gastric case. First of all, we know that IBS is caused by mental nervous system hyperactivity. So, of course, this gentleman was treated on the entire 5-point model and got training in heart math and things like that. And the level 1 gastric protocol was eliminate dairy, take a probiotic and enzyme with every meal. And with this level 1, 50% of people would be completely cured from this, as long as they've learned how to control anxiety and things. Within 4 to 8 weeks, if they're not cured with this, we go to level 2, where we add glutamine and aloe. And when we add glutamine and aloe, at that point, 75% of people are cured. Great, because we know you cannot leave a gastric situation untouched. Gastric system has the greatest nervous system in it. It also is the seat of almost every chronic disease you can think of. So we really go after gastric cases extremely aggressively. And then there's level 3, the patient who doesn't get cured, that other 25%. So another 4 to 8 weeks later, and you end up at level 3. And here you're stuck with either testing the stool, and looking for parasites and infections, or doing muscle tests for infection or HCl, hydrochloric acid, which most people are actually deficient in, and other gastric products, including other probiotics and enzymes, because sometimes the probiotic mix that we've chosen is not the right one. We also additionally in all these patients use very strong food-derived mechanisms because, of course, we know, as we talked about, that the source of the nutrition and the treatment makes a difference. So we teach kombucha classes and fermentation and encourage the patients to do that. But sometimes we end up switching probiotics and enzymes, and with this we have over a 95% cure rate with things like Crohn's and ulcerative colitis, sustainable, and all kind, heartburn, reflux. I want to give you 2 steps. So this is a photograph of my father sitting on the beach watching a sunset on Anna Maria Island last year. We celebrated his 80th birthday. And I cannot think of anything that speaks more clearly about correcting our energy field than sitting and putting our feet in that sand or even in that water. You know how many people all around the earth went into water bodies to cure, and filling the heart with love and light and connecting back to the earth. This is one of the most powerful mechanisms. I showed you some pictures of it that I think that we can do, and I encourage you to do this. So with that, I am done, and I really thank you for being a very nice audience and taking the trouble to listen to this webinar. I thank Lindsay for organizing this and A4M for giving me the opportunity to share this journey. It's a great journey, and many of you will end up in this spot at some point when you're trying to cure difficult things. Thank you.
Thank